One of the earliest memories of Christmas that I have is the arrival of a parcel all the way from Dundee to my home in Calcutta. Pre-Christmas period was peak parcel time in Calcutta. Plum puddings, haggis, mistletoe and holly for homesick Scottish jute sent by family was to help recreate a feeling of home. Ours was one of the very few destined for Indians. I knew what it contained even before we opened it. Distinctive with many stamps from Scotland, it was as regular as the festive season it heralded. Inside, carefully wrapped in brown paper and cellophane, snug in a white and red cardboard box, within an identical box, with Fisher and Donaldson regally printed in white against a red label on its sides, and tied with a red and green red tartan ribbon, was a domed brown cake. It was accompanied by a greeting card wishing Katie and family a very happy Christmas, and was signed simply by Mrs. Ryrand. I associated Christmas with the parcel, which was unfailingly delivered in mid-December. The cake was not as colorful as the ones we were surrounded by in Calcutta. It was very brown and studded with almonds. My father, Katie in the card, told me a story about a queen who disliked cherries and was placated by almonds. I never fully grasped the storyline. So outraged was I at the thought of anyone not being partial to glacé cherries. However, I knew that unlike other families, this cake was our Christmas fare, no matter how wistfully we looked at other more festive, at least to my 5-year-old mind, creations on the park street. When the parcel stopped sometime in the late 1960s, my father made his way to the Grand Eastern Hotel on Chaurungi Road in Calcutta to get the best version of Dundee cake this side of the Tay. I was brought up in the jute mills along the River Hooghly, just outside Calcutta, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. My father, K.D. Chowdhury, was one of the first post-independent Indians to train at Dundee Technical College in the 1950s and returned to India to take over the management of the mills as the Scottish jute mill wallahs were departing. The cake we received every year was almost symbolic of how closely Dundee and Calcutta remained entwined by jute long after Indian independence. We witnessed this period of transition as we inherited and continued a particular way of life of another 20 years. Please excuse my emotions. We were part of the jute mill family community living in compounds, gated communities for mill management. Once my father settled in his new job, he married, and my brother and I were brought up in the jute mill compounds. While the mill manager's bungalow was lavish, almost all jute mill office family quarters had luxurious high ceilings, fireplaces, and mantelpieces, and furnished with Victorian teak furniture. We had salted porridge for breakfast, orange marmalade on toast for breakfast, and an orange marmalade on toast, machhe chol or fish curry for lunch, and then jelly and custard for pudding at dinner. At the time, we thought it all pretty normal. Although the Scots outnumbered Indians in mill management in the 1950s and early 1960s, they had started to leave Calcutta. By the 1970s, had completely disappeared. So we were well placed to have observed the embers and nuances of colonialism. My talk focuses on these transition years. Slowly, Indianization of our lifestyle began with the first appearance of the samosa instead of the haggis on the spotless damask tea table alongside custard creams, bourbons, and pastries. The Sunday Night Film Club began introducing an occasional Bollywood alongside Tarzan and the Westerns. And by the 1970s, the celebration of St. Andrew's Day was replaced with Dasera. This process was not an overnight occurrence, rather a gradual erosion, a slow shedding of layers. While most of my memories revolve around one jute mill, Anglo-India Jute Mills, where I grew up, I was lucky to have lived in jute mills as far north as Bandel, that was the Ganges jute mill, and as far south as Bajbaj, almost close to the port of Calcutta. All mills were variations of the same Scottish theme. Anglo-India Jute Mills, where my father started his career in 1956, was situated on the right bank of the River Hooghly. Around Calcutta and stretching convoy-like for over 35 miles north and 25 miles south of it is Little Dundee, made up of over 90 mills at their peak, with names incongruously evoking the Scottish Highlands in a tropical sprawl. Alexander, Angus, Auckland, Belvedere, Braithwaite, Cheviot, Dalhousie, Waverley, all remnants of the heady developments which followed the success of Ackland's first mill in Rishra in 1855. Approached by the road, jute mills presented a walled face to the outsider, with huge green gates at residential and factory ends, which were manned by military-like sentry. It was only when a manager's car was allowed in by the darwan, or the security, that the gates swung open and the passerby got a glimpse of the Shangri-La within. This was the jute compound and formed the residential quarters for jute officers. The factory end was situated directly opposite the sprawling bastis or shantytowns where the mill workers lived. If a passerby were to sneak in behind that manager's car, they would find themselves in an alien space. Emerald-striped lawns cropped like velvet and edged with annuals, smooth and sinuous tar macadam roads linking these green spaces with huge red brick buildings and verandas. There was no hint of the dust, people, or hustle and bustle of the outside world. Throughout the 1960s, 70s, and mid-80s, a steadily diminishing army of workers was in place to maintain these spaces. That errant visitor would probably not have noticed the sweepers who had been up at dawn to keep the roads immaculate for the day ahead, but would definitely have spotted the Marleys or the gardeners going about their chores. By this time, the trespasser would be discovered and unceremoniously thrown out by the darwans. This idyll was forbidden to everyone but the families of jutwalas. This quiet maintenance was part of our daily lives, so that even as children, we could tell the day of the week by the activity. Every tennis court was mowed on Tuesdays, rolled on Fridays, and lines freshly chalked on Saturday afternoons. The swimming pool was drained on Friday morning and scoured by a team of cleaners ready for the weekend. The club bearer took receipt of a lorry of drinks from Calcutta to stock the bar on Thursdays in preparation for the Saturday whist. Student unrest at the Vietnam War was rocking Europe and America. West Bengal was in flames with the Naxalite movement throughout the 60s and 70s, but a parallel universe existed serenely within the mill walls. India's first botanic gardens in Calcutta was already established in 1786, and it was possible for homesick Scots to buy everything from asparagus to quince in the new market. Sutton and Son set up shop in Calcutta in 1912, and so great was the demand that after 1950 it enjoyed an uninterrupted monopoly of flower and vegetable seeds to Calcutta's clubs and jute mill gardens. The partnership between the Marleys and Suttons, with keen input from the Scots, transformed the jute mill spaces in the tropical Gangetic Plain into a patchwork of English cottage gardens. Hollyhocks, snapdragons, chrysanthemums, dahlias, pansies, pinks, and sweet williams exploded in borders everywhere. The club wall was edged with blood-red poinsettia bushes, the site precisely chosen to provide a seasonal backdrop to Christmas. Roses had their own special sunken gardens and showcased cuttings from Kew to Lucknow. An early experiment by Mrs. Pepperell, the general manager's wife, to cultivate climbing orchids never really took off, despite valiant efforts by the Marleys and much consultation via long letters to the superintendent of the Royal Botanic Gardens of Calcutta. The green clumps still dangled from the trees they were attached to and remained defiantly flowerless to the end. There were trellis arches brilliant with bougainvillea, married with orange trumpet vine to create eye-searing semicircles. Oleanders, pink and white, planted at regular intervals, set off the dull red brick of the finishing mill walls. The residential quarters were quintessentially colonial English. Made of red brick, most family homes were spacious apartments, high-ceilinged and came furnished with heavy mahogany Victorian furniture, hat and coat stands, magnificent mirrored almirahs, generous dining tables, and zinc-topped kitchen tables. Sitting rooms had a fireplace as standard, and until the early 1960s, coal was delivered every winter. The proximity to the river and general draftiness of the rooms meant this was not as outrageous as might appear at first sight. The Mill Club was the hub of its social life. This was managed by the formidable Women's Committee under the benevolent aegis of the male club secretary. The club hall hosted social events from the Sunday cinema to the Christmas party. At the mill I grew up, the club also included a decent-sized swimming pool, billiard and snooker room, a well-stocked bar and library, and while undoubtedly grand, was more or less a template of all jute mill clubs that I was to encounter. From the 1960s, the departing Scots were handing over the reins of the various social committees to Indians. In the discreet but cutthroat world of the ladies' social hierarchy, the first essential skill was mahjong. Whole afternoons were devoted to this in the club hall. Tables were arranged to accommodate 4 players at each one and made with spotless starched damask. In the 1920s, mahjong had become a craze throughout the empire as well as America. From the 1930s, interest had started to dwindle in the mother country, but it continued unabated in the jute mills. So great was the interest that the monthly game was not enough, and private mahjong parties were hosted in homes. When my mother arrived, most of the players were Scots. Her ability to speak English endeared her to these dowagers, and she was invited to learn the game in the privacy of these select private gatherings. Mahjong was only a warm-up for the main act, the Christmas party. The Scots celebrated Christmas Day purely for children, leaving the adult dinner dances for hogmanay. Every child in the compound knew the actual moment Christmas was around the corner, when the club bearer brought out a giant conifer and set it in the club hall by the fireplace. It was traditionally the evening when the coal fire was also lit for the first time, with chairs arranged around it. The resplendent sparkling tree by the roaring fire seemed equally at home in tropical Calcutta as it was in temperate Dundee. The party itself, with long trestle tables laid with linen and children gay in paper Christmas crowns, was easily recognizable across the world, from Jamaica to Sydney via London. While children collectively shared Christmas parties, we had our own individual days, our birthdays. My cousin celebrated birthdays in the traditional Indian muted style, with a special rice pudding and a blessing from the family god. But we grew up the Scottish way. We had new frocks and parties with cakes and presents. Birthday tea was standard fare, again easily recognizable from Dundee to Darwin. A slice of birthday cake, tomato sandwiches, cheese straws, and biscuits. From the 1970s, many birthday parties started offering Indian snacks. Idlis, samosas, and even dahi bala was arranged with pastries and sandwiches. Our party dresses were made by the local darzi or tailor. The Scots had provided darzi with butterick and simplicity, children's patterns, and he replicated them faultlessly. We wore tartan at Christmas and organdy in summer. Darzi proved adept at accommodating changes in fashion, even taking bell-bottoms and jeans in his stride. All he asked was for a sample to copy. However, as the late 1970s, Indian fashion scene embraced more ethnic clothes like lungis, shararas, and kararas, we preferred the sophistication of Calcutta tailors. Darzi still carried his faithful butterick and simplicity catalogues with him in hope and as a buttress against the fickleness of fashion. The Scots left a rich legacy of personal cooks or bearers. They were usually Muslim and hailed from northern Bengal or Murshidabad. They were well trained in coaxing shepherd's pies, chicken and mutton roasts, rich stews and soups from the temperamental baby Bellings. All dishes were liberally seasoned with Worcester sauce, including and especially the roast chicken. So kitchens always had an unmistakable vinegary tang. Bearers were trained in the art of table laying. Napkins were folded just so into bishops' hats, fleur-de-lis, diagonal pockets for everyday dinner, which was served promptly at 7. The fan was the most popular because the linen, fresh from the dhobi starch, provided an impressive 3D effect. While they were well versed in their own traditional Indian dishes, they felt unfulfilled when their new Indian employers preferred more prosaic Bengali daily meals. I remember my mum patiently explaining to our bearer why roast chicken for Sunday dinner simply couldn't be tolerated every Sunday. She finally compromised by agreeing for a pudding every evening. So we grew up eating Queen of Pudding, jam, roly-poly, and custard, freshly made from brown and Polson powder, bread and butter, and then the most common, jelly and custard, after a dinner of curry and rice. Meal times in most Indian families, especially those returned from Dundee, were interesting. Breakfast at 9 was a family affair and fully Scottish. Porridge with salt, followed by bacon, toast, baked beans, and fried egg. My father was particular about his toast, and he really missed his landlady's crisp slices. Mid-morning was a ladies' affair. Instant coffee and biscuits were ready for anyone dropping by. I remember the incongruity of my mum sharing feral knitting patterns from Women's Weekly modeled against snowy hills under a whirring ceiling fan. Women's Weekly knitting patterns circa 1960s were modeled well into the 1980s by Indian jute mill children. The only Indian ladies magazines at the time, Femina and Eve's Weekly, posed no competition at all. Old habits die hard. I found on my return visits from the UK, as recently as the 1990s, still being requested to bring Women's Weekly magazines. There was unanimous agreement that the knitting pattern standards had deteriorated. The compound social calendar was quite busy, and there were a few posts for those with flair. My mum became the first Indian female club librarian responsible for selecting and purchasing new books and in charge of the Wednesday night library. There was a male club social secretary for the whist nights, Saturday tombola, and Sunday film night. So a 1950s Dundee lived on in the social mores and customs of Indian jutewalas and their families through the 60s and the 1970s. From the late 1970s, increasingly Indian celebrations like Holi and Dasera dinner replaced Hogmanay and Burns nights. There were occasional dance evenings on St. Andrew's Day when my father donned his dinner jacket and bow tie, and my mum went to Calcutta's Blue Heaven hair salon to have her beehive balm. But by the late 1970s, they had completely died out. The incoming younger Indian jute officers had no interest in the waltz. From the early 1980s, the last traces of the Scots in the social calendar had disappeared. Newcomers to the mills tended to be locally educated, and Bengal had fallen under a long spell of communist-led local government. Dundee educated mill managers like my father were adjusting to and facing a management style from the new Indian mill owners very different to the Scots. Within the mill compounds, the Malis kept the valiant fight going on in the herbaceous borders. The once sacrosanct lawns were now used to dry lengths of saris, while tennis nets were convenient washing lines during the day. The swimming pool was filled up to cut down on costs, and while the new Indian Sahids still enjoyed the chota pegs at the bar, club halls no longer rang to legs 11 or housey on Saturday nights. Thank you.